History claims the Roman Empire fell in 476, wiped from the map overnight. But the day Romulus Augustulus was cast aside, senators still debated, taxes got collected, laws were updated, and an emperor ruled strong in Constantinople. The so-called fall looked nothing like an apocalypse. Instead, routines and power structures adapted while the world still called itself Roman. If Rome supposedly died in a moment, why did its language, laws, and very identity dominate Europe for centuries after? This is the day the Roman Empire didn't fall, a story that shatters the myth and reveals what really endured. So if the empire didn't end, what did happen next? Pressure on the Roman Empire did not begin or end with a single day. For more than 2 centuries before 476, the empire faced waves of crisis that would have shattered most states. In the 3rd century, emperors came and went at a dizzying pace. Over 24 claimants fought for the throne between 235 and 284. Civil wars erupted across the provinces, while armies on the Rhine and Danube mutinied or broke away entirely. At the same time, invasions from Goths, Persians, and other groups battered the frontiers. Cities that had once felt secure behind Roman walls now found themselves under siege or even sacked. Disease struck just as hard. The so-called Plague of Cyprian, beginning around the 250s, swept through the empire year after year. Some cities lost up to 1/3 of their people. The impact went beyond simple numbers. Fields went untilled, armies shrank, and tax rolls thinned out. With fewer hands to work and fewer coins to collect, the government resorted to desperate measures. The silver content in Roman coins plummeted by more than half over a generation, fueling runaway inflation. Soldiers and civil servants demanded to be paid in kind, not in debased currency. Prices soared, and the cost of basic goods could change from one month to the next. All of these shocks, war, plague, inflation, fed into each other. As the treasury emptied, the state struggled to maintain its vast bureaucracy and border defenses. Local leaders in the provinces sometimes took matters into their own hands, declaring loyalty to Rome while acting independently. Meanwhile, the empire's population steadily declined, dropping from an estimated 60 million at its height to around 35 million by the early 600s. The West, in particular, lost ground. Provinces in Britain, North Africa, and Gaul slipped from direct imperial control. But even as the empire shrank and changed shape, its core routines, taxes, laws, and administration kept going. What was at stake was not the existence of Rome itself, but how much of the old order could be preserved in the face of relentless pressure. By the late 200s, Roman emperors faced a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. Diocletian, who came to power in 284, understood that the old ways of governing no longer worked for an empire stretched from Britain to Syria. Instead of clinging to the idea of a single ruler, he introduced something completely new: the tetrarchy. In 293, Diocletian divided authority between himself and a co-emperor, each with a junior partner, so that 4 men governed together, 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars. This system was meant to keep the empire stable, no matter how many crises erupted at once. Each ruler had his own capital, court, and army, which meant that threats on different frontiers could be handled at the same time. Diocletian's reforms went far beyond the imperial household. He reorganized the provinces, breaking up the old, sprawling units into smaller, more manageable territories. Governors now reported up a clear chain of command. with layers of oversight that made it harder for any one official to seize power alone. The tax system was overhauled to make sure that armies and civil servants were paid in real goods if coins lost their value. Military pay was regularized, and the government began to collect taxes in kind, grain, oil, and other staples, so that soldiers could be fed even when money was short. This new bureaucracy, with its regular census and land survey, became the backbone of Roman administration for centuries to come. Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337, kept these basic structures in place, but made them more flexible. He shifted the balance between the eastern and western halves, allowing for regional capitals and parallel chains of command. The empire's administrative map was redrawn, and new official titles appeared, like praetorian prefects and comes, to reflect the layered system. The point was not just to survive the immediate crisis, but to create a government that could adapt and endure. Even as frontiers changed and new threats appeared, the machinery Diocletian and Constantine built kept the empire running. These reforms made it possible for Roman institutions to outlast emperors, invasions, and even the eventual loss of the western provinces. The routines of tax, law, and administration, set in motion by these reforms, would carry on in one form or another long after the old borders had vanished. When Romulus Augustulus was forced to step down in 476, the change in power played out more like a carefully staged ritual than a violent break. Odoacer, the new strongman in Italy, didn't declare himself emperor or tear down the old order. Instead, he instructed the Roman Senate to send an embassy east, carrying the imperial regalia, the diadem and the purple cloak, to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The message delivered by the senators was formal and clear. Italy no longer needed its own emperor, and Zeno should be recognized as the sole ruler of the Roman world. In their words, the West was content to be governed by one emperor, with Odoacer serving in his name. Zeno, sitting in Constantinople, hesitated at first. He still recognized Julius Nepos, who had ruled in Italy before Romulus and was living in exile across the Adriatic. But the reality on the ground was impossible to ignore. Odoacer held Italy, the Senate backed him, and the regalia had arrived in the eastern capital. Zeno ultimately accepted the new arrangement, granting Odoacer the title of Patricius, a high Roman honorific, and allowing him to govern Italy as a sort of deputy. In his official response, Zeno insisted that Nepos remained the legitimate Western emperor in name, but he acknowledged Odoacer's authority in practice. Odoacer carefully navigated this political theater. He minted coins not in his own name, but in that of Zeno, and avoided the imperial title altogether. In official documents and public acts, he presented himself as a Roman official, not a rival emperor. The Senate continued to meet in Rome, issuing letters and decrees that referenced the authority of the emperor in Constantinople. Even as the lines of power shifted, the legal formulas and rituals of Roman government remained in place. Letters preserved by Cassiodorus and later chroniclers describe the ongoing correspondence between Italian officials and the Eastern court. Administrative acts, appointments, honors, and legal decisions were still issued according to Roman precedent. The regalia's journey east and the Senate's embassy were not the end of Roman rule, but a visible effort to show that in law and custom, Rome's government continued, now with its center of gravity in the east. For those living through these events, the machinery of empire kept turning, just under new management. In the years after 476, daily life in Italy carried on with more routine than revolution. Magistrates in cities like Rome and Ravenna still opened their offices each morning, recording land transfers, collecting taxes, and updating the census rolls, just as their predecessors had done for centuries. The Senate continued to gather in its ancient meeting hall, debating local affairs and sending formal letters to the emperor in Constantinople. Even under Odoacer's rule, these traditions were not only preserved, but depended upon by the new regime to keep the machinery of government running. Taxation, in particular, followed the old patterns. Surviving receipts from the countryside around Ravenna show landowners paying their dues in grain, oil, and sometimes coin. The records, written in the careful Latin of imperial bureaucracy, list names, property boundaries, and amounts owed, often referencing laws and formulas unchanged since the time of Diocletian. Municipal officials, many from long-standing Roman families, oversaw the collection and distribution of these taxes, reporting up the chain to regional administrators, who in turn answered to Odoacer's government. Land survey papyri, some preserved in the damp soils of the Po Valley, detail the boundaries of estates and the obligations attached to each plot. These documents, stamped and witnessed by local notables, confirm that the cadastral system, the backbone of Roman fiscal order, remained in effect. In the cities, public works were maintained as best as resources allowed. Aqueducts still brought water into Rome, though repairs grew more challenging as state revenues shrank. Magistrates organized the repair of streets and the upkeep of markets, using funds drawn from the same municipal treasuries that had served the empire. The Senate, while no longer the true seat of imperial power, retained considerable prestige. Senators continued to sponsor games, endow churches, and mediate between the local populations and the new authorities. Their correspondence with Constantinople, preserved in collections like the Variae of Cassiodorus, shows a world still governed by Roman legal tradition, even as the faces in power changed. For most people, the rhythms of obligation and authority felt familiar. Taxes were still collected, courts convened, and the machinery of law ground on. The language of edicts and official appointments echoed older formulas, tying the present to the long memory of Rome. While the empire's borders had changed, the habits of administration and the expectation of order endured. It was not a vanished world, but one that had learned to adapt, with local magistrates and Roman senators keeping the old system alive under new names and new masters. Theoderic the Great arrived in Italy in 493 with a promise to restore order, but he did not replace Roman government. He relied on it. The offices that had run the empire for centuries remained at the heart of his administration. The Senate continued to meet in Rome, and Theoderic's own court in Ravenna was filled with Roman aristocrats. Cassiodorus, a Roman senator, and later Theoderic's chief minister, left behind a collection of letters, the Variae, that show the daily business of government still ran through familiar channels. Petitions for tax relief, appointments to magistracies, and disputes over land were all handled using the same bureaucratic formulas that had been in place since the days of Diocletian and Constantine. Roman titles and offices did not disappear under Ostrogothic rule. The urban prefect of Rome, a post that had lapsed during the previous decades of turmoil, was restored by Theoderic in the year 500. Roman consuls, praetorian prefects, and provincial governors continued to serve, often drawn from the same families that had held power for generations. The Senate itself still carried weight, Its members advised the king, mediated disputes, and managed city affairs. Theoderic addressed the Senate as the most illustrious order, and his correspondence with them was couched in the ceremonial language of imperial Rome. The machinery of tax collection and public works also persisted. Theoderic's officials kept the land registers up to date, assessed the grain tax, and organized repairs to aqueducts and city walls. Cassiodorus's letters describe the funding of games in the circus, the restoration of public baths, and the maintenance of roads. Even the process of appointing local magistrates followed Roman precedent, with formal letters of nomination and approval from the court in Ravenna. For most Romans, the experience of government, paying taxes, seeking justice, watching the city's fountains flow, remained rooted in the old routines. Theoderic's approach was pragmatic. He ruled as king of the Goths, but he governed Italy through Roman law and Roman officials. The administration was a hybrid, with Gothic commanders leading the army while Roman elites managed the bureaucracy. Cassiodorus, whose career flourished under this arrangement, became the voice of continuity. His letters, full of references to Roman tradition and legal order, offer a window into a world where the forms of empire survived, even as new rulers sat on the throne. In Theoderic's Italy, Roman and Gothic worlds overlapped, but did not dissolve into each other. Theoderic understood that stability depended on preserving the habits and privileges of Rome, even while ruling as a Gothic king. His government ran on a principle that would have seemed strange to earlier emperors: one country, two legal systems. Romans were judged by Roman law, with Roman judges and familiar procedures. Goths followed their own customs, especially in matters of inheritance, marriage, and military discipline. This arrangement, set out in the Edictum Theoderici, meant that a land dispute between two Roman landowners in Ravenna might be settled by a Roman magistrate quoting the Theodosian Code, while a quarrel between Gothic soldiers would be handled under their own traditions. In cases that crossed the lines, say, a Roman and a Goth in conflict, special mixed courts tried to balance both sets of rules. The system was not perfect, but it allowed both communities to recognize themselves in the law of the land. At the heart of this hybrid order stood men like Boethius, a Roman aristocrat, philosopher, and high official. Boethius rose to become Magister Officiorum, a post that put him in charge of government administration, correspondence, and even palace security. He was fluent in Greek and Latin, wrote on mathematics and music, and translated Aristotle for a Western audience. For a time, his career seemed like proof that Roman elites could thrive under Ostrogothic rule. Boethius's father-in-law, Symmachus, was another pillar of the old senatorial class, and together they represented a world where Roman learning and public service still mattered. But the balance was fragile. In 524, Boethius was accused of plotting against Theoderic, possibly because he tried to defend fellow senators from charges of treason. The king, wary of conspiracies and religious division — Theoderic was an Arian Christian, most Romans were Catholic — ordered Boethius's arrest. From his prison cell, Boethius wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, a work that became one of the most influential books of the Middle Ages. In its pages, he reflects on the rise and fall of fortune, the uncertainty of power, and the search for justice in a changing world. He was executed later that year, a stark reminder that the old lines between Roman and Gothic could be both a shield and a trap. Yet the machinery Boethius once managed did not break down after his death. Cassiodorus, another Roman senator, took up many of the same duties, preserving the forms and language of Roman administration. The Senate continued to meet, laws were still issued in careful Latin, and city life revolved around familiar rituals. Theoderic's regime relied on the cooperation of Roman elites, and the dual legal system gave both peoples a stake in the new order. This blend of traditions would shape Italy for generations, even as the center of Roman authority shifted further east. In the eastern Mediterranean, the city of Constantinople rose as the beating heart of what its people still called the Roman Empire. The old imperial rituals, which once filled the forums and basilicas of Rome, found new life in the grand halls of this city by the Bosporus. Emperors processed in robes of purple, surrounded by officials who bore titles straight from the days of Augustus and Constantine, praetorian prefects, consuls, and senators. The language of government shifted over time from Latin to Greek, but the sense of Roman identity remained unbroken. In official documents, laws, and even everyday conversation, the people of Constantinople called themselves Rhomaioi, Romans. The empire itself was known as the Basileia ton Rhomaion, the Empire of the Romans. Ceremonial texts from the imperial court describe elaborate processions and rites, blending Christian liturgy with echoes of the old imperial cult. The emperor was still greeted as the August One, and the court maintained a strict hierarchy, with senators ranked by seniority and function. The city's economy rested on solid ground as well. Gold coins stamped with the emperor's image, the solidus, circulated from the markets of Antioch to the trading posts of the Danube. The solidus maintained its purity, weighing consistently over 4 grams of gold, and became the trusted currency not just in the empire, but across much of Europe and the Mediterranean. Hoards of these coins have been found as far afield as Britain and Egypt, a silent witness to the enduring reach of Roman economic power. Titles and rituals were not empty gestures. They provided a framework for government, law, and daily life. The Senate continued to meet in Constantinople, and the office of consul was still awarded each year, even if the role had become largely ceremonial. Public works, from aqueducts to city walls, were maintained and expanded, funded by taxes collected under the same principles that Diocletian and Constantine had established centuries before. Roman law was updated and enforced, with new edicts issued in the emperor's name. The imperial bureaucracy, staffed by generations of officials, kept the machinery of state running smoothly, recording births, deaths, land transfers, and tax payments in careful detail. The people of the empire did not see themselves as living in a post-Roman world. For them, Rome had simply moved east. The habits of administration, the prestige of Roman law, and the authority of the emperor continued without interruption. Even as Greek became the language of the court, the identity remained Roman. This enduring sense of who they were, Rhomaioi, citizens of the Roman Empire, gave Constantinople the confidence and resources to weather storms and launch new campaigns. The empire's gold, its law, and its sense of continuity would shape the next phase of Roman history, long after the old capital had faded into legend. Justinian came to the throne in 527 with a vision that stretched far beyond the walls of Constantinople. He saw himself not just as a caretaker of tradition, but as a restorer, someone who could reclaim the glories of old Rome and bind its scattered parts together under a single law, a single faith, and a single emperor. The project began with the law itself. For centuries, Roman legal codes had grown unwieldy, layered with centuries of amendments and contradictions. Justinian ordered his jurists, led by Tribonian Tri-Boichni-an, to sift, clarify, and codify the entire body of Roman law. Between 529 and 534, the Corpus Juris Civilis was compiled, a monumental achievement that gathered imperial edicts, juristic writings, and centuries of precedent into a single, authoritative code. For generations to come, this collection would shape not only the empire, but much of Europe's legal tradition. But Justinian's ambitions were not limited to the law. He wanted to give the empire monuments that would proclaim its enduring greatness. In 532, after the devastation of the Nika riots, he commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia. Built in just 5 years, the new basilica opened in 537, rising above the city with a dome that seemed to float on air. Inscriptions in the building still echo Justinian's own words, "Solomon, I have outdone you." The Hagia Sophia became the heart of imperial ritual and Christian worship, a symbol that the empire's creative power was not spent. Justinian also looked west and south, determined to bring lost provinces back into the imperial fold. He turned to his greatest general, Belisarius, Bel-I-Sar-I-Us, who led fleets and armies across the Mediterranean. In 533, Belisarius landed in North Africa and shattered the Vandal kingdom in a matter of months. Soon after, he crossed into Italy, fighting a long and bitter campaign to reclaim Rome itself. The wars were costly and the gains would not last forever, but for a generation, the old provinces of Africa, Italy, and even parts of Spain once again answered to Constantinople. Through law, architecture, and conquest, Justinian's reign stands as the last great flowering of Roman power. The codified law, the soaring dome of Hagia Sophia, and the brief restoration of imperial borders all testify to a world that still called itself Roman, and believed, at least for a time, that Rome could be reborn. Roman law did not vanish with the loss of emperors in the West. Instead, it found new life under rulers who valued its authority. In 506, the Visigothic king Alaric II issued the Breviary of Alaric, also known as the Lex Romana Visigothorum. This legal code, written in Latin and compiled by Roman jurists, gathered together centuries of imperial laws and commentaries. It was designed for Roman subjects living under Gothic rule in Spain and southern Gaul, allowing them to settle disputes and manage property according to familiar statutes. The breviary drew directly from the Theodosian Code and the writings of classical jurists like Gaius and Papinian. Its pages include formulas for contracts, inheritance, and court procedure that would have been recognized by any Roman official from the days of Theodosius or Constantine. This was not an isolated case. Across the former empire, new kings and councils issued similar compilations, preserving Roman law for Romans while applying their own customs to their peoples. Burgundian and Ostrogothic rulers did the same, creating dual legal systems that allowed different communities to live by their own rules. Court records from these kingdoms show lawsuits decided by Roman law, with judges quoting from the old codes. The Church also became a guardian of Roman tradition. Bishops, often drawn from the old senatorial class, kept archives of legal documents and acted as judges or mediators. Church councils adopted Roman administrative practices, and church property was managed using the same legal forms as before. In everyday life, the habits of Roman law, contracts, wills, property rights, remained the framework for order, even as kings and armies changed. For many people in the West, living under new rulers meant adapting to new faces at court. while the law that shaped their rights and obligations still bore the stamp of Rome. Charlemagne's coronation in 800 stands as one of the clearest examples of how the idea of Rome became a powerful political brand. On Christmas Day, inside St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown on Charlemagne's head. The crowd greeted him as Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. For the first time in more than 3 centuries, the West had an emperor who claimed direct succession from the Caesars. The ceremony was steeped in Roman ritual. Charlemagne wore imperial robes, received the acclamation of the people, and was anointed by the Pope, just as Roman emperors had once been blessed by senators and priests. Official documents and coins began to refer to him as Imperator Romanorum, and his court adopted Roman titles and ceremonial forms. The justification, recorded by Einhard and the Liber Pontificalis, was that the imperial throne in the West had been vacant, and, with the Eastern emperor's legitimacy in question, Rome's legacy could be revived in a new Christian ruler. This reuse of Roman authority was not limited to the Carolingians. Centuries later, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow's rulers looked to Rome for their own claims to greatness. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, married Sophia Palaeologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, in 1472. Russian chronicles and clerics soon declared Moscow the Third Rome. The idea was spelled out in letters from the monk Philotheus. 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will not be a fourth. Ivan adopted the double-headed eagle, a symbol taken from Byzantine imperial banners, and began to style himself Tsar, a word derived from Caesar. Official charters described the Russian ruler as the heir to the Roman emperors, defender of the Orthodox faith, and sovereign of a new, unbroken Roman realm. Through ritual, marriage, and symbols, both Charlemagne and Ivan III claimed the prestige of Rome to legitimize new empires, showing that even long after the last emperor in Rome had fallen, the name and idea of Rome still carried unrivaled weight. Roman power unraveled in stages, not with a single collapse. In the early 600s, Heraclius faced disaster as Persian armies stormed Jerusalem in 614 and Alexandria soon after. Chroniclers like Theophanes and Armenian sources describe Heraclius leading battered troops deep into Persian territory, reclaiming lost ground by 628. The victory, though, was Pyrrhic. Both empires emerged, shattered, their treasuries empty, armies exhausted, and borders exposed. Within 10 years, Arab armies surged from the south. Theophanes, Sebeos, and Al-Tabari record the swift loss of Syria, Egypt, and the Levant. In Egypt, papyrus tax records vanish after the 640s, a silent end to centuries of Roman order. The empire, cut off from its oldest provinces, was now a shadow of itself. The Mediterranean, once a Roman sea, became a contested border. Constantinople endured, but the world it ruled had slipped away. In 1204, a new calamity struck. The Fourth Crusade, intended for Jerusalem, turned on Constantinople instead. Nicetas Choniates describes the chaos as Latin soldiers broke through the walls, looting churches and palaces, fires raging for days. The government collapsed. The imperial family and Senate fled. For the first time since Constantine, outsiders ruled the city. Though the empire would return, it never truly recovered. The scars of 1204, fragmented administration, lost confidence, remained. 1453 brought the final blow. Mehmed II's Ottoman forces besieged the city, pounding the walls with artillery. George Sfrantzis An eyewitness recounts prayers in Hagia Sophia, the emperor's last speech, the desperate defense. Constantine XI died fighting, his body lost. For 3 days, the city was given over to chaos before Mehmed claimed Hagia Sophia. The last echoes of Rome faded as the crescent replaced the cross. Yet the idea that Rome ended in 476 only took hold centuries later. In 1776, Edward Gibbon's sweeping narrative fixed that date in public memory. The myth endures, not for accuracy, but for its simplicity. The real story, as the evidence shows, is far more tangled and far more compelling. When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, the Roman Senate continued to meet, taxes were still collected, and imperial law remained in force. Clear in surviving land registers and legal edicts, the Eastern Empire, calling itself Roman for nearly 1,000 more years, issued coins bearing the imperial image and preserved the Corpus Juris Civilis, which shapes modern law to this day. Yet, questions persist. How did ordinary people in Italy or Gaul perceive these changes? And where exactly should we draw the line between Roman and post-Roman? What the evidence does show is that Rome's institutions, identity, and even its name adapted across centuries, governments, and faiths. Textbooks may favor the date 476, but the documents, coins, and laws reveal a complex, gradual transformation. The story of Rome is not one of sudden collapse, but of survival and change. Rome did not fall, it changed form.